The future of the United States Senate is at stake, Anne-Marie, as Georgia voters head to the polls today, where they will cast ballots in two key runoff elections. President Trump and President-elect Joe Biden held dueling rallies for the candidates yesterday. Mr. Biden is banking on Democrats winning both races so he can forge ahead with his top legislative priorities, while Republicans hope to maintain control of the upper chamber. Senator David Perdue is facing off against Jon Ossoff, and Senator Kelly Lefler is up against Raphael Warnock. CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns has the very latest.
Georgia, the whole nation is looking to you.
The 2020 campaign is finally coming to an end.
This could be the most important vote you will ever cast for the rest of your life. It really could be.
Georgia voters will decide which party controls the Senate, high stakes that have attracted the biggest figures in politics to the state.
The power is literally in your hands. By electing John and the Reverend, you can break the gridlock that has gripped Washington and this nation.
We need two senators that will get in the way of the radical agenda of the Democratic Party and fight for Georgia every single day.
Georgia's election system requires a runoff if no candidate receives 50% of the vote. In November, the state's two incumbent Republican senators, David Perdue and Kelly Lefler, fell below that threshold. Just one of those Republicans has to be successful for the party to keep control of the Senate. If both Democratic candidates, Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, win, there will be an even split, with Vice President Kamala Harris as the tie-breaking vote.
Our seat, Kelly's and mine, will determine the direction of our country for the next 50 to 100 years.
Georgia, we are the firewall to socialism.
Democrats are hoping to recreate the turnout from the general election that turned the state blue for the first time in 28 years.
We have seen record voter turnout across the board in this runoff election.
There were people out there in Georgia that voted for both Perdue and Joe Biden. Why do you think that is?
Well, I got more votes than any Georgia Democrat running statewide in the history of this state. There were some folks who voted in the presidential and didn't vote down ballot. There were some folks who voted for the Libertarian candidate in the Senate race. Now it's head-to-head, and we are getting out the vote like never before.
Republicans have a perfect track record in winning runoff races here, but their message is complicated by the president, who went so far as to ask the Secretary of State to find votes to overturn the general election results.
Tonight, our mission here in Georgia is to make sure the radical left cannot rob you of your voice and your votes in Washington. The Democrats are trying to steal the White House. You cannot let them. You just can't let them steal the U.S. Senate.
Voters here on both sides say they're motivated to vote with Georgia in the spotlight.
Everybody's looking up to Georgia right now. Everybody, all the states are looking, but we got to do this.
It's been really cool because this never happens with like two Senate races, so it's really neat.
Everything that America stands for Atlanta is on the line.
One right we have in our lifetime is to vote and pay taxes. And if we take the vote away, we haven't got anything.
First time I've actually been excited about voting. I mean, usually I vote, but it's just very different this time.
It's just good to have my vote matter in a state where everything seems to be the center of the universe.
So for more on this, we want to bring in James Arkin. He is a Senate campaign reporter for Politico. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, James. So I want to ask you just where we are in the race so far, based on some of the factors that we usually consider, like early voting data or fundraising numbers. But I don't even know if those factors carry the same weight that they used to carry, in previous elections.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for having me on. I mean, in terms of the early voting, I think what we know is that Democrats feel really good about what they were able to do to turn their voters back out. Historically, Democrats have struggled in runoffs in Georgia to be able to get their voters back out, and that's because there's just been drop-off, and they've had bigger drop-off than Republicans have, and that's why the GOP has had so much success. And that hasn't happened this time. Democrats have gotten their vote back out. The black share of the electorate is higher than it was in the November election through the early vote. More than 3 million Georgians have cast their ballots so far. And so what that means is that Republicans are relying essentially on a really, really high turnout and a significant win today on election day. they're going to need a bigger win on Election Day today than they had in November if they're going to be able to have success. Now, that's entirely possible. And that's the reason that President Trump was in town last night to do that rally, to push his supporters to come out and vote and to get all of the voters who voted for him in November back out again. But that's where we are coming into this is, Democrats have essentially done what they can do to put themselves in a position to win. And now Republicans are looking to make up that ground.
As we saw in Caitlin's report, President Trump campaigned in Georgia yesterday where he ramped up those baseless voter fraud claims. This, of course, comes after he was recorded pressuring Georgia's Secretary of State to find votes for him to overturn Joe Biden's win there. So how is he impacting the runoff races? Are Republican voters either there can only, I guess, be two sort of outcomes, right? They're either fired up by all of this because they love it when the president takes on the establishment as they view it, or when he attacks his competitors, when he attacks people who he deems disloyal, or they're turned off by it because he's telling them that their vote doesn't count.
Yeah, the way I've been thinking about it is that President Trump, throughout these runoffs, has sort of become the cause of and solution to Republicans' problems. I mean, certainly his rhetoric, his conversation with the Secretary of State, his attacks on the Republican Governor Brian Kemp, none of this has been particularly helpful to Republicans, if for no other reason than it's dominated coverage and forced them to respond and kind of thrown them off of their message. And so that's created a real concern among Republicans working on these races that, some of President Trump's supporters who think that the election was rigged and believe his claims, his false claims that he won Georgia in November might not come back out to vote. But also, they're relying on President Trump, as he sort of did last night, both saying the election in November was rigged, making that false claim again last night, but also telling his supporters to come back out and vote again today. And so, he caused some problems. He made things a little bit more difficult for Kelly Lefler and David Perdue, but also they're relying on him to get those supporters back out and to, have success. They need those voters back out, and we'll see today what kind of success they have.
Yeah, and I argue he may be firing up the Democratic base, too, because he's sort of reminding everyone of this sort of, in his mind, an election that isn't over yet. And so every time they go to the ballot box, they're thinking about this presidential election that happened in November. But I'm going to go, that's down a whole other road. I want to ask you about Kelly Lefler, one of the Republican incumbents. She has already vowed that, when she's back on Capitol Hill, that's what she's predicting, that she's going to challenge the Electoral College vote. Tell me about just how this plays into her appeal to Republican voters, the impact that it could have, the significance of her making that announcement.
Yeah, Kelly Lefler had been not saying where she stood on that January 6th vote in the Senate over the Electoral College for a couple weeks. She'd been facing questions, essentially since that vote was targeted by some Republicans as a potential way to try to challenge the election results. And Kelly Lefler took a couple of weeks where she said, everything's on the table, but she would not say how she would vote, and then put out a statement just hours before President Trump arrived in the state, and then went up on stage at his rally. And the first thing she told the crowd was, I'm going to be voting to object to the Electoral College. And so I think it's very simple what you can read into that. This has become a divisive issue for Republicans, and the president's base and the president's supporters think you're either with him or you're against him. And Kelly Lefler decided that she needed to be with him on that vote, and that's why she announced it right when he got into town and announced it the evening before the election. Like I said, this is just all an effort by Republicans to try to make sure that their voters don't stay home today. And I think it's pretty clear that it was determined that that was a necessary position to do everything that she could to make sure that happens.
Yeah, I mean, she wasn't going to get up on that stage and say, you know what, I'm going to be, faithful to the Constitution. Anyway, James, one of the things that is really sort of interesting to me about what's going on in Georgia and the president's baseless claims of voter fraud, you had a really interesting statement from Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky yesterday. And in this statement as to why he wouldn't be supporting those senators and some members of Congress who plan to question the results of the election tomorrow, he says something really interesting. And I don't know if it was it's got to be, it couldn't have been inadvertent. But he says, I'm just going to read it here. From a purely partisan perspective, Republican presidential candidates have won the national popular vote only once in the last 32 years. They have therefore depended on the Electoral College for nearly all presidential victories in the last generation. Now, why that's interesting to me is essentially he's telling on himself and what Republicans seem to understand, which is that they are not able to win the popular vote. They haven't been able to do so for many, many years. They rely on the Electoral College. And Massey goes on to say that if we allow Congress to reject the Electoral College votes, that could be problematic, not just for Republicans, but for Democrats too down the line. It's interesting that Kelly Lefler is now siding on that side when the president and his supporters have been telling folks in Georgia, your votes don't count. And he's trying to get the Congress to overturn the election. And it's just interesting that she would throw her hat in the ring for it.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, I've seen it all weekend throughout the final end of the campaign here. Every Republican who's been down in Georgia talking about this vote, I mean, you bringing up that statement is really interesting, but I think the way that they're trying to sort of toe this line or walk this sort of high wire, act to try to get their voters back out is, their voters here believe that the election was rigged. They believe it was stolen. I've been to the state a few times to cover these runoffs. I've yet to speak to a Republican voter who told me that they thought Joe Biden won and would be president-elect on January 20th. And when your voters feel that way, and so much of that voter sentiment is fueled by the president's false claims and by the Republicans in Congress who have sided with the president on that belief. But when your voters feel that way, the only way to get them back out to vote is to essentially argue, that's true, that what they feel about the election is true. And so we've heard Republicans, Senator Ted Cruz was here campaigning, and he made this statement that was really interesting, which was essentially, if you believe that the election was stolen from President Trump in November, come out on Tuesday in such large numbers that they win by such a high degree that it can't be stolen this time. And so again, they've sort of fueled this belief among Republican voters that the election was stolen in November. And so now the best way to argue to get those voters back out is to say, don't let them do that again. Obviously, this has fueled a lot of energy on the Democratic side. Democrats were thrilled to flip Georgia for the first time in decades. And, to have President Trump and other Republicans saying that it was stolen, just adds fuel to the fire for Democrats who say, no, it wasn't. We're going to come back out and we're going to show that we can turn Georgia blue and that we did that and we can do it again. So it's just really fanning the flames on both sides. But it's really what Republicans have to do if they want to have success today.
Yeah, I mean, James, you make a great point there where you say that they have fueled these allegations, these mistruths, this misinformation. They've thrown it out there into the mix. And people start believing it because it's the president of the United States or it's their elected members of Congress. And then those same members of Congress, including the president, say, the rumors are out there that this election is rigged. But you're the ones who started it. And that's what is sort of mind-boggling about all this. James Arkin, always great to have you, my friend. Thank you very, very much. Appreciate your reporting.
Thank you.